February 1946, diplomat George Kennan, then stationed in Moscow, sends a telegram of some 5,000 words to the State Department, known in history ever since as the Long Telegram. There we are, just after the end of the Second World War, just at the very inception of the Cold War, and Kennan gets everything in those 5,000 words. The nature of the Soviet Union, where it's strong, where it's weak, and then he lays out the policy of containment that remains the fundamental American policy. Some presidents are truer to it, others attempt to depart from it, but it remains the fundamental policy for all 4.5 decades of the Cold War. Why hasn't there been a long telegram about China?
Man, why questions are always so hard to answer?
When will there be a long telegram about China?
I will speculate that if we haven't gotten the memo, it's been lost, or it's not going to be coming anytime soon. And my theory on why there hasn't been one and there won't be one is that people don't have a great long-term strategy for the U.S. of how do you accelerate things, how do you overtake China? They don't know how to fill out the details. Maybe setting China aside, maybe a correct broad strategy for the U.S. is to have a gradual withdrawal from the world, and you could never articulate that if that's the correct strategy, because the retreat becomes a rout. And so if the correct strategy is for the U.S. not to be overextended, overcommitted to the sort of world empire that we're committed to, you can't actually articulate that ever.
Hard to pursue a policy when you can't talk about it to each other.
And then if you can't talk about it, that's maybe even worse. So it's, but I think my placeholder is that there's something about the best policy that if it's articulated, the articulation itself will stop us from executing it properly. And maybe there's some way to contain China, and probably we're best just figuring out a way to do it without articulating it.
All right. I heard you the other day. You said that we now find ourselves between Scylla and Charybdis. Greek mythology, narrow strait. Scylla is a six-headed monster over here, and Charybdis is the whirlpool over here. And in Greek myth, you had to navigate between these two, each of which was deadly. You described our Scylla and Charybdis. Actually, and here's what you said in a recent paper that you wrote: the stable deterrence structures of the Cold War look much shakier as more countries acquire nuclear weapons. It seems far easier now than at any time since World War II to sleepwalk into an all-out conflict. So the prospect of Armageddon, let's call that Scylla. And here's Charybdis, an endless stagnation. I'm quoting from the same paper. We have grown attached to our soft, comfortable ways, but we do not want to name what they are protecting against. How bad, of course what I have in mind is the war in Ukraine. How bad is the Scylla, the prospect of Armageddon?
Well, the thing that I want to say that's always nuanced and complicated is that it's quite bad, but we have to also weight it against the alternative. And
yes.
The extreme alternative is the sort of soft totalitarianism, a society that simply is locked down where nothing happens. If you were to use the biblical terminology, it's the Antichrist, the one world totalitarian state, and there's always a sense where I think we should be at least as scared of the Antichrist as of Armageddon, and then certainly my contrarian intuition is that people are far more worried about Armageddon than they are worried about the one world state, and I would at least like us to worry about them equally, to worry both about Scylla and Charybdis.
Okay, so elaborate a little bit.
There are all these different versions of it. There's a recent paper by
The Armageddon we sort of talked about at the opening.
Well,
the Armageddon is we pursue science and we pursue technology, and it could all blow up in a nuclear war.
And then let's elaborate it.
Yes.
So if you don't if we're going to stop that, you can't just stop it locally. You have to stop it globally. You have to make sure that all scientists stop it. You have to make sure that they're being policed all over the world. And if there's some small piece of computer code that can lead to a runaway AGI, we need to have surveillance technology installed on every single laptop to make sure that people aren't typing in keystrokes to code up the AGI that's going to destroy the world. Or if you can, the nuclear weapons issue already from the 50s and 60s, what came with this multinational atomic energy agency that was going to, International Atomic Energy Agency, that was going to sort of monitor all these countries, and you needed a supranational structure with real teeth. And in practice, we ended up with something in between. We ended up with some kind of global superstate. It wasn't never quite that much. It was maybe not quite enough to fully stop Armageddon. It was never quite enough to be totalitarian. But those have been the bad alternatives for 77 years, and we need to find some way in between.
Okay, and the lockdown. We fear Armageddon too much.
We only talk about it strikes me we almost only talk about the Armageddon stuff, and we never talk about the sort of regulatory political lockdown that's the practical alternative, where everyone's just scared of their own shadow.
So if we put it, I'm trying to bring growth back into this. To pursue growth means in one way or another to have the courage to risk a certain degree of new innovation. We unleash technology and science again to produce growth, correct?
Yes.
All right. So, and why do you and I, because we have known each other a long time and think alike in some pretty basic ways, we both say growth and assume that that's a good. But let's make that explicit. Why do we need growth? What does that do for American society? And why is what happens, or the other way around, what happens to us in the absence of growth?
Well, we had, the Club of Rome wrote this book called The Limits to Growth in 1972, almost exactly 50 years ago. And it basically said that, the growth couldn't continue, and so we had to get used to a zero growth world. First, a world of zero population growth, then a world of zero economic growth. And there are all these ways that their agenda broadly has been implemented over the last 50 years. And it has, in some ways, perhaps it's stabilized the world, but it's also been profoundly destabilizing it's led to a world that's extremely nihilistic. It's led to the sort of cultural disintegration of the middle class, where you think of the middle class as the people who think their children will do better than themselves. And there's sort of all these ways the zero growth world hasn't worked out that well. And so my intuition is that it's not simply stable. This is where I disagree with Doubt, that it's not simply decadent or simply stable. It's not simply entropic. It's ultimately, there's ultimately a catastrophe on both sides.
So,
and there's an Armageddon catastrophe if you have unconstrained tech and science where no one's paying attention and people are just pushing buttons and seeing what happens. But there's also always a risk of a centralizing totalitarian catastrophe on the other side, which is the natural solution on how do you stop all science and tech. Is you need a one world state with real teeth,
which is within our grasp, humanity's grasp, as AI emerges.
Well, it's an answer to the nuclear problem. It's an answer to the environmental challenges. It's an answer to the AI challenges, and I would just submit it's not a good answer.
All right. So, sticking with growth, just for one more moment, if I were to close my eyes and just listen to the dulcet tones of Peter Thiel, a Republican pro-growth president gets elected in 2024. What's different? What's different about what's different about the temper or mood of the country? Could we hope that economic growth would soothe the bitterness of our politics? Is that what happens?
Sure, I think if you had growth that was non-inflationary, non-cancerous, non-apocalyptic, it would solve all our problems. And it would, now, I don't know how realistic it is or how easy it is to get there, but certainly, the extreme sort of Malthusian zero-sumness of the stagnation, extreme
Evaporate.
polarization, I'm not sure it would fully evaporate, but, it would be lessened significantly. And without growth, I'm certainly very convinced the negative version of this, where without growth, you're not going to solve the polarization, you're not going to solve the nihilism, the anger, any of those things.